And welcome back, everyone. Today we are going to go ahead and make another example of a user interface. Today we're going to incorporate some of our previously created icons for us to go ahead and help us create something new. So in this example, we're going to create a user interface that might be used in something, for example, like let's say a game or an application that we might have on our phone. So to really get our scale here and to help keep us increasing the skills that we've been doing, we're actually going to take our dimensions a little further than we did last time, and we're going to go ahead and create a canvas that's 640 pixels by 480 pixels. And so of course we're going to do this time though do this in a horizontal alignment. Last time we did vertical, but today we're going to do horizontal. Let's go ahead and click on create here, and you can see we now have a really decent sized canvas that we can work with. And to get started, I'm going to go ahead and open up some of my pre-existing images. So let's go ahead and pull down some of those right now. Alright, and so I went ahead and selected ones I think are going to work really nice for this. So I have my composite shield here, I have my moon, I have fire, and I took my rainbow gem. Alright, now there are going to be a couple things that we're going to have to do with some of these, because some of these you can see have multiple layers, so I can't simply just bring them over. Now I could of course just export them as images and bring them in that way, which works as well. And we might do that for some of these here. Or if they are single layers like this, we can of course drag them right over into our document and work with them. Now before we get started here, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create my background here, because today I'm actually going to make that first, just so we have something to kind of work with as we start filling this. Now let's go ahead and do a gradient, and I'm going to go ahead and let's do something a little different here. Or actually, let's see if we can find a nice pattern that's going to work for us. So let's do a pattern fill here, and we see we have a couple options. We have some nice water here, some grass, and we also have some tree options. And now the one thing we do have to be careful is when I do this pattern fill now, because I'm so much larger than where I was before, you can see it actually generates the trees here, for example, as a pattern. Or if I choose one of these here instead, and I try to fill that in, though, just Control Z just to take that off there, you can see we are actually getting almost like an actual image in here. So the one thing we have to be careful about is when we start using some of these patterns here, and we start filling things in, at the higher resolutions that we do, it physically is going to render that full image. Now there are of course advanced Photoshop techniques that we can do to go ahead and take these elements and make them much more unique. There's filters and stuff that we can do to kind of make these much more dynamic. I'm not going to get too much of that in here today. I'm just going to go ahead and keep this water pattern here, or maybe I might choose one of these other ones that might maybe look a little bit more appealing to me. But again, this one looks pretty good for us to start, and I think we're just going to run with this today. Again, there are advanced Photoshop techniques, but we're not going to cover those in today's lesson. Instead, we're going to focus on getting these elements in. So the first thing I want to do is, of course, I'm going to go ahead and use my rectangular selection here, and let's go ahead and make a box here just to kind of give us a visual representation of how big our elements are going to be. And let's just go and make a new layer here, and I'm just going to call this elements, just so we can kind of get a visual representation. Now, most of our elements here are 64 by 64 or 32 by 32. So if I drag this in here and go to about 32 by 32, you can see this is very, very small, which could potentially be an issue, especially if we're looking at something like a phone. That's going to be a very small element, which could cause potential issues. Not saying it's impossible to have something that small, because sometimes you're just representing something, like maybe it's just a visual element on the screen, you're just showing an animation. But if we're using something, let's say we want them to be able to click on something, then we might say, I want that element to be a little bit larger. So then if we look at our 64 by 64 here, and you can see that looks a little bit closer to something that might be usable. At 64 by 64, we have a pretty good size image. And let me just go ahead and just so you can see this, let me get that to 64 by 64. There we go. And I'm just going to go ahead and fill that in. Let's just use a gradient. And if I drag across that, you can see there is a 64 by 64. And that, again, is a pretty good size. It would represent what we're trying to do here pretty well. And that's perfectly acceptable. But what if I wanted this just to be a little bit larger? What if I wanted to make sure that this element is really going to stand out? Well, I could, of course, deselect here, take this, And let's go ahead and go up to a 96 by 96. So that's kind of the halfway between 64 and 128. And let's use our gradient tool just to kind of give a visual cue of what that looks like. And this is a 96 by 96 element here. So this is a good size element. And I think for today, let's go ahead and use our 96 by 96 here to represent what we want to do. And just to kind of help give us some background here, I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste this a few times here, just so I have 4 of these. And I'm then going to use my move tool to kind of move these all so they're kind of right next to each other. Nice thing about this, you see, as I move these next to each other, you can see that this vertical line or horizontal line will come up. Those are snapping guides for us to kind of take these different pieces here in Photoshop and move them around so we can kind of make this nice even shape. And then I can do one step more. I can use my selection tool, my rectangular selection here. I'm just going to click and drag over this, and you notice it will make a large rectangle above this. What if I want to move all these at once? What if I want to pull all these elements together? So let's just deselect here. I'm just going to go ahead and hold down my shift key to grab all these here. And now I can move this all as one big element. That looks fantastic. Let's see if we can center that. You can see we got a vertical line there. And so this will kind of end up being a guide for us as we start putting our elements into place. Now, there is one more thing I want to put in. I maybe want to put in a circular element. So let's just go ahead and grab a elliptical tool here. And let's hold down the shift key and let's go ahead and take this one. We're going to go a little bit larger than 128 for this one. Let's go more till we get to a good size here. 128 is right in here. There we go. There's 128. And of course, I can move that here. Now you can notice at 128, it's not as maybe as large as we may think it is. But again, if I go ahead and fill that in with my gradient, of course, I don't have a layer active for that. So there we go. Now we're on that layer. I can go ahead and fill that in. There's that selection right there. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste it just so I have a second one. I'm going to go ahead and move that one over to here. And you can see, again, my guides are showing up to help make this a lot easier. All right, we have the basic structure down. We've already done the heavy lifting. Let's bring in our elements of things that we've done before. Again, we can go ahead and use this in Photoshop here to drag this right in. Of course, I may have to, because these are so many different things, merge these down temporarily. Don't save it if you don't want to lose your layers. And then I can drag it over. Or if I had an image of this, I can, of course, just open that image and drag the image over. Let me go ahead and just pause the video real quick and show you how to do that. All right, so I have the composite shield now made. I had to go and export it because I did not have one ready. So you can see now this says PNG instead of PSD. And of course, I did that just by going to File and Open and then finding this file on my computer. And if I go ahead and drag this over and take it to our UI, it will work exactly the same way as it would with if we had our PSD files. And I can go ahead and kind of center that. Now, of course, you notice it is smaller than my element. And sometimes that's handy because if it's smaller, I can automatically kind of have a native border here around this image. So it kind of looks a little bit more visually appealing. Now, I might say, you know what, that looks pretty cool, but it's a little small. Maybe I want to scale this image up here. All right. And the nice thing about this, I now can, of course, use my different pieces in here to go ahead and scale it. And of course, I have the ability to transform. I can scale things pretty easily, and you can see it pops right up. And if you remember, when we do this scaling here, we have a couple different options that we can work with. Now, if I just go ahead and here height and width, and I say, hey, you know what, I don't want this 100% bigger. Maybe I want this to be something like 120% bigger. I can do that. And then if I go ahead and hit apply, you'll see that it goes ahead and scales it. Now, the nice thing about this is, again, it's using our different kind of scalings here. And I want to go back to that real quick here. You notice my interpolation this time was on bicubic. If I go back to nearest neighbor and do that same thing, let's do 120. And let's go ahead and apply that. You'll notice, though, it was not kept here. All right, and that's one thing I want to show. If you do this as an image and bring it in, you actually want to make sure that when you do that transformation here, that you do it as bicubic. All right, because we're actually going to use an image here, and that's been rasterized so that way it's using different mathematical things to kind of try and keep this image looking the way it is. Holding down the shift key is another way you can kind of try to expand this a little bit here. But you can notice we do have some distortion. So keep it on bicubic. Let's make this 120. Hit apply. You'll see it kind of maintains what we were going for. All right. Now, if I, of course, had done this with this way, and I had merged this down and brought it over, you will see that we want to keep that nearest neighbor because everything's still much more in a pixel form. So when you make it in as an image and you bring it in, you're no longer using it as a pixel form. It's not that raw data that Photoshop says, hey, I need to use nearest neighbor on. So just a quick note there. So let's go ahead and look at our moon. Now, this is a PSD file, so I'm just going to go ahead, drag that on over. Let's go ahead and just drop that right in there. Now, of course, this moon is at 64 by 64, but it is, of course, not the same size as our shield now. So we're going to just use Control T. And let's go ahead and scale that again, 120. But remember, this one needs to be set to nearest neighbor because this is done from a Photoshop file. So I'm just going to go ahead and click OK. And you can see it helps maintain that aspect ratio that we were going for. All right. And let's go ahead and do fire. Now remember, this fire that I had done was originally 32 by 32. So when I bring this one over, you can see it's very, very small here, which means I'm going to need to do a lot more scaling here to really kind of get that up to speed. So let's just go ahead and double this. Let's do 200%. That should take us about to 64 by 64. So let's do, see, 220 is not quite there. So if we do 240, that looks great. All right, and again, nearest neighbor, hit OK. Boom, there's our fire. All right, and last we have the rainbow gem. Now the rainbow gem, I did not export this because I want to show you how to do this. I have all my layers, so I'm just going to select all those layers there. So I'm going to use the old shift key to bring those together. Right click, and I'm just going to merge visible. And you can see it makes it into one image. Again, do not save this if you don't want to lose access to all your layers. This is just kind of a temporary maneuver. Now I can just go ahead and drag that image over, set it on in. There's my rainbow gem. Looks great, especially since it doesn't have that background there. And now I can use Control T. Now the one thing about this, because it is transparent, it doesn't have the same height ratio that we may have with these ones that have that border around it. But it's okay. We can still go ahead and know like this was originally kind of about the same size. So let's go ahead and try to just do 120. And that should work. Nearest neighbor, hit OK. There is our rainbow gem. All right, so things are coming together here pretty nicely. Now, of course, you will notice that with that rainbow gem that we do have a little bit of kind of some of these images might be distorted just a little bit here with some things. And sometimes that does happen when Photoshop has to make some of those best guesses here of bringing these different pieces over. And so if that ever happens, you can, of course, play around with these different settings here to try and get the image that you might truly be desiring. So maybe I say, you know, I want this, maybe try this, try 120. I can try bicubic. And you can see it does get a little blurry here, but it can maintain that a little bit nicer. All right, so we have our base images set up. The last thing I want to do is, of course, just add a little bit of effect here to these. So I'm going to go to my elliptical tool again. And I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick selection here, kind of try to center that. That looks pretty good there. Maybe up a little more. And I'm just going to now take a gradient and apply it into this selection here. Now, of course, this selection I want to make sure is on a new layer because I don't want to disturb any of my previous layers. And let's go ahead and use our gradient tool. And I'm actually going to go ahead and look for something that's a little bit different here. Let's see, maybe what kind of colors do we have available to us? Maybe not a grays. Greens. We haven't really done much with any greens here, so I'm just going to go ahead and pick this one. Or maybe something a little bit darker. Now that looks a little off here, so find one that looks good to us. Maybe change the mode so it's more radial. That looks a lot nicer using a radial one. And I'm actually now going to go ahead and copy and paste this. Grab my move tool. And grab this and put this one over here as well, just so we have a duplicate here. All right. Now, of course, our user interface is pretty much all set up with what we need. If I go ahead and just Control minus, just to zoom out a little bit, you can see we've set up this really nice user interface. The only other thing I could do is a little bit of housekeeping here to go ahead and, for example, group some of these different elements together. So, like, for example, these are all my UI elements here. So I'm just going to go ahead and group those and call this UI elements. And then I'm going to go ahead and maybe group all my icons together. So let's go ahead and group those. Call this icons. And these, of course, were also UI elements that I forgot to put in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag those into the UI elements folder just to kind of clean everything up here just a little bit. And now, of course, I could do further cleanup. For example, I can go ahead and rename these individual elements. So, for example, this was my shield. This was the moon, fire, gem, and so on. And of course, I can do that with all these other elements. Now, the only other thing I could do here is I could, of course, add some text and stuff like that. So, for example, if I wanted this to represent maybe some kind of portrait, I could put like player portrait or player name, and which, of course, is very easy to do. We can just use our text tool like I showed in our last lesson. But there we go. We've created a nice kind of user interface, really quick, really easy. I showed you how to bring in different elements and also how to scale them appropriately to kind of fit within the different things that we are doing.